Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. With host and founder, Richard Case, and co-host and retreat leader, Kathy Ricconi. Join us every weekday at this time to discuss news, spend time in the Word, and receive answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is End Times Friday, and we are taping this the first week of January. So 2026 is here, and lots has happened since we last visited. Couple big things, and we'll talk about a few more. But the United States captured Maduro from Argentina, and supposedly is doing something to operate the country, which we'll talk about. But also that in Iran, and we talked about this last time, that they're starting to experience some real collapsing, with water and provision, and just the whole thing just isn't working for them. And you've got a populace now that is suffering and is protesting. And what we'd like to talk about, to start with, Eric and Ephraim, is what do you know is going on there, and what's the current condition of that? And then we'll talk about what do you see as potential outcomes as what's happening. This is a kind of a momentous moment, really. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, I'll start. From my understanding, and I've been listening to a lot and reading a lot about this, and that at this point, virtually no intelligence agency in the West believes that these protests are likely to lead to any kind of significant change in the structure of the current regime. It's lacking some key ingredients that are necessary for the equivalent of a revolution, primarily a leadership that has the organizational and inspirational leadership skills that can actually lead to some kind of overthrow. But it is weakening the regime considerably, and it's probably the weakest it's been almost since the inception of the Islamic Republic, most people would assess. And I think many Western analysts believe that the current leader, Khamenei, is 87 years old, apparently deaf, and spends most of his time hiding underground. And so, and there's not a clear, what's the right word, ascendancy or succession that has been announced, at least not publicly. So I think it's at his death that I think many people believe there'll be an inflection point, and that's a matter of not days, perhaps months, certainly not decades, but a matter of a few years for that inflection point to hit. And I'm not sure anyone really knows what will happen. There are theories that it could be a military. Very few people believe that like a democracy would emerge out of this thing. Right. Most people would believe that or assess that it'll probably lead to an interim regime of some kind, either led by senior members of the IRGC, that is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or the army, or some combination. Whether they can fix the problems is doubtful, because a lot of the problems are severe corruption throughout the entire infrastructure of the regime. And the IRGC is probably the most corrupt of the corrupt. They actually benefit financially from the international sanctions and everything. The IRGC is able to make a fortune off its own population, kind of like Hamas does. At the expense of its own population, they can line their pockets with a lot of money by selling goods and services. They can sort of sneak into the country to the general population, and they sell things to individuals and institutions that are aligned with them, and that eventually filters into the population after everyone makes a ton of money on the contraband. And so people are, everyone understands this in Iran. Everyone's fed up with it, but it's not. The regime's been quite effective at eliminating any sign of leadership that comes out of the protests. They kill them, they torture them, and it's been a very effective policy for preventing any kind of leadership to emerge. I think that's how from my understanding, that's how the Israeli intelligence assesses the situation.
Eric, we hear in the United States every now and then from the family of the exiled, the old exiled leaders. Is there any, do they have any following or any import in any of this?
Well, some of the demonstrations they've been shouting, his name. I think it's Reza Pahlavi is his name.
Yeah, that's.
I don't know. I'm a bit skeptical, but I don't have any personal or firsthand information one way or the other. But it seems to be very difficult for him to insert himself as a leadership in this kind of a role.
Is the sense that you hear that this is all spontaneous, or there is something organized behind these protests?
Good question. From what I've read and heard, it seems to be not so well organized so far. I think there have been some appeals to Elon Musk to enable Starlink throughout the country, and I think that could help because communications need to be established that can be protected from the government's infiltration. So. As far as I know, I'm sure most intelligence agencies are monitoring the situation and tracking it, but I don't know if they're actively involved.
Can you describe what is causing the population to be upset and want to do something different, although you've described they really don't have the power to, number two, and then what exactly are they doing there? When we protesting, we know in America it's just, well, they march with signs and have speeches and stuff, not necessarily, do anything, but is what actually is causing it? And then two is what exactly are they doing to protest it?
Well, their inflation rate is enormous. We're talking about, somewhere between, depending upon the year, 40 to 100% per year. And their currency is called the real. And I read that you need to pile up a suitcase full of currency to basically buy a cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. It is so way out of whack. There's no water. The regime has misused, this is a mountainous region, which ordinarily would get sufficient rainfall to fill reservoirs and rivers. And they've misused, they basically provided water for free to the farmers because the farmers are a privileged group within this regime. So the farmers just leave the taps on 24 hours a day. And they're just flooding and misusing their resources because they're free, because the government, abuses it. So they've misused their water resources. And there was talk as long ago as like a month or two ago that the president, not the supreme leader, but the president of the country, talking about evacuating the capital, Tehran, because of the water problem. It's on an aquifer, and when you deplete the aquifer to the extent that they have, you have issues with the foundations of the soil holding up. You can get, what I forget what the term is. There's a term for it where the soil begins to collapse and structures begin to collapse. So, you have no water. You have very severe lacks of food on what is ordinarily a very abundant country. The natural resources, even not including the oil, which is vast in the country, it's a very rich country in terms of natural resources, and its population is starving and dying of thirst. And yes, there's an abundance of oil, but the infrastructure for pumping the oil and distributing the oil is antiquated and hasn't been updated in tens of years because they're not enabling any Western or foreign entity, either because it's under boycott or because they want to do it themselves, to come in and update all the infrastructure for pumping the oil and distributing it. So they're relying on very old infrastructure in order to be able to ship oil to China and maybe under the table to other countries. And China's taking it also illegally by international sanctions. And so there's no solution in sight because no one's motivated to help the population. And so you asked, I think, before the show started regarding whether there's going to be a war or not, or what's going to happen. There's a lot of saber rattling. From everything we can gather, the subject was discussed when Prime Minister Netanyahu just recently met with President Trump over New Year's in Washington, D.C. But I don't think that I don't think the military in Israel nor the intelligence community is encouraging the government to pursue any kind of war if it can be avoided. Primarily because if Israel were to do anything that would rally the population around the flag, okay? And that's what the government tried to do during the 12-day war. to some limited success. In fact, there were a lot of signs at the conclusion of the 12-Day War that as a response, the governments, which is called the Islamic Republic of Iran, bear in mind, that they started, rather than emphasizing the Islamic symbols of the country, they started recovering the, Iran is the descendants of the Persian Empire, which was one of the greatest empires of mankind many years ago. And it was during that period that the Jewish story of Purim emerged, where it was a Queen Esther, one of the queens of the king at the time, which I believe is believed to be Cyrus. It's called Ahasuerus in Hebrew, and that saved the Jews. And so the story came during the period of the Persian Empire, which was a very wealthy empire that reigned until Alexander the Great, the Greek king, overthrew it in something like 300 BC, if I recall. Right.
That's right.
So it has a very deep wealth of history, culture, knowledge. The people themselves are very innovative and creative. There are a lot of incredible movies that come out of Iran today that some of your listeners may have seen that are smuggled out, and they're incredible. Many of them are Academy Award material because of the subject material and the acting capabilities. So it's a very rich culture that's basically being kept in a primitive situation by a very corrupt regime.
When they are protesting, what does that look like? What are they actually doing?
Well, besides the protest, there have been a lot of signs where they've gone into grocery stores and either trashed them or looted them. But these grocery stores, for the most part, the grocery stores run by and on behalf of members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Okay, so because people know they're so corrupt, or what's called the Basij. The Basij is like the internal police that are in charge of enforcing the Islamic laws of how you cover your head for the women and things like this, and modesty and things like that. So they've been attacking some small symbols of the government. There have been signs. I'm not sure they're how vast they are, but there have been isolated signs where the local police have basically been cheering on the looters without, That's also a necessary element for a true revolution, is that the elements and symbols of the existing regime must at some point switch sides. Okay. Yeah. Historically, how revolutions happen. I'm not sure it's, from what I've seen or read or listened to, it doesn't seem significant enough to really make people think that this is the revolution that's going to topple the government. But it's showing that this, just how corrupt and void this regime is of any legitimacy.
And Rabbi, what are you hearing and perceiving? How does the Jewish population view what's happening right now over there in Iran?
All right, thanks. Well, that was an excellent analysis, Eric. I would just want to add to what Eric was saying, that the background of the frustration with all the economic problems and shortages and inflation, that they're very aware that one factor in that is that the Islamic Republic has spent a fortune over the last several decades on arming terror organizations around the world, like Hezbollah and Hamas, and fomenting terror and unrest all over the place. And that's been like a major agenda and budget item for them. So we see, what have they gotten out of that? And especially now after Israel's, decimation of Hezbollah and degradation of Hamas and the attacks in Iran and Syria, they just, all that money went like poof up into the sky. So that's, I think, also part of the frustration of the Iranian people. And that, as you know, that there's a very significant population in Iran, which is not deeply fundamentalist Islamic, because it was a very secular country before the revolution. And from what my understanding is, somewhere around half of the population or something is much more on the secular side. So they're already feeling oppressed and repressed by the Islamic regime. So that's also going on. So the people in Israel, we're sitting back and watching and just, hoping that somehow the Islamic Republic does collapse. And any weakening of it, any distraction of it is a healthy thing to happen for the region. It's less exportation of terror. It's less influence with neighboring countries, and all that's good. So We hope it goes further. But again, we often underestimate the brutality and that these regimes resort to anything to maintain their power. So it's really, really hard. Look at Hamas in Gaza. They've been completely decimated, but they're still holding on to power and trying to rebuild. And they do that by killing and torturing everybody in their way.
Yeah.
And it's hard to fight that.
Ephraim, is there much of a Jewish community or a Christian community in Iran?
There's a very tiny Jewish community in Iran, and most of the time they're respected and not persecuted. They're decidedly second-class citizens as defined by Islamic law, that any Jew or Christian living in an Islamic country is a second-class citizen, but entitled to, some of the rights. There is a protection under the law in theory, but the synagogues are respected. So most of the Jews left, hundreds of thousands of them left in the 70s. But some remain, and they're living.
Many of them are living in Los Angeles.
I was going to ask, are many in Israel, or did they leave the Middle East, as Eric said?
There are many in Israel.
And so is there an Israeli among those group? We see in the United States all these reactions from U.S. Venezuelans that live in the U.S. and have for a while. Is there a similar dynamic from Jewish Iranians that are now living in Israel?
There have been there are no symbols for them to go organize a protest around, or demonstrate. There's no embassy. There's nothing like this. So, but your listeners will probably be interested to hear that the Army has a language school where they train inductees and help them on the language so that for their intelligence. It's part of what some of the people who are familiar with Israelis may have heard of this unit called Shmona Matayim 200, which is an intelligence unit of the Army. And there are three languages they deal with there. One is English, because everyone in the world speaks English, so including our enemies. The second is Arabic, which is pretty clear. And the third is Farsi, Persian. So there's a lot of intelligence that's gathered and filtered through the system where people are monitoring communications in Farsi, which is the Persian language.
And then, of course, the final part of this, Rich, is at least the rumors around a second attack on the attempt to rebuild. It's hard to imagine, given what you guys just described as the economic strife in the country, that there's much of a nuclear military rebuilding effort, but that we're hearing about that.
So, yeah, it's true. Basically China is resupplying either fully built missiles or sub-assemblies to try to assist the Persians in rebuilding their arsenal. And it is a threat to Israel, and there's a lot of concern within the establishment about, if they launch like 2,000 missiles at one time, it would really overload the defense infrastructure of Israel, and many more would get through. And this is, of course, I think the biggest fear. But you have to mitigate that is now the right time? And when is the right time to deal with that problem? And so when you have a situation like this, especially a regime which sees itself as under imminent, threat, and a real threat to its legitimacy, it would serve the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs. It would only serve their interest to launch a war today, because it would in fact distract the protests. It would in fact enable the regime to crack down even harder than it is by claiming that it's under attack. So the word is that the Israeli government, through its connections to Russia and Putin, communicated via Russia to Iran that it has no intentions of initiating any kind of war at this time. So the idea being that because everyone's saying we have to preempt the other side. And when you have situations like that, it just takes one small finger to pull the trigger, and then boom, you've got a war.
Yeah.
So there's an interest, I think, within Israel to try to defuse that. Okay.
Is and when you had even the situation with Gaza, Israel's humanitarian desire was to provide aid to those suffering, even though they're an enemy. Is that same thought or ability going on in Iran? Is Israel doing anything, or at least desire to do something to assist the people who are suffering in Iran?
There's nothing above the table that's, being talked about. It's not clear Israel could do anything if it wanted to. The presumption is that the Mossad, the intelligence agency of Israel, is still quite active in Iran. And I would doubt that, it's doing anything to promote or orchestrate these demonstrations, even though the regime would love to prove that it's foreign rather than domestic. I mean, that's what they claim all the time. But, there's communications when you're doing something like this, communications between groups within Iran that are anti-government is very critical. And it's possible that Mossad is helping out in some regard in that. I alluded to it earlier that there have been some calls to Elon Musk to try to deploy Starlink, and so that people can communicate. I'm not sure he's done that yet, and I'm not sure he will. We'll see. It's not a dig on Elon Musk. It's just that there's just so much corruption. You just never know when those Starlinks are going to land in the hands of the IRGC. I can't speak for Elon Musk.
Yeah, because that requires a physical thing to happen.
Right. Besides the satellites, which are probably already in place, it requires a lot of physical receivers and transceivers to be distributed, and it's not clear that he did it in the Ukraine because it was a lot easier to do. I'm not sure it's so easy to do in Iran.
Yeah. Rabbi, any thoughts on that in terms of?
No, just I also know that there are many Persian Jews. The Persian community, especially in the United States, has been active in different organizations and supporting any type of resistance, because to them it's like their homeland. Also, they grew up here. Very often their families were many generations. They love the country, and they basically were exiled, and they would love it to be restored. And I know many people in the community and many orgs have actively worked to support the type of resistance to the Islamic regime.
Yeah.
Well, the community there, as well as the community in Iraq, the Jewish communities I'm talking about, they're thousands of years old, and they know it. I mean, they keep alive their traditions, and so the Iraqi Jewish communities will never be recovered. But it's possible that the Iranian Jewish community one day, some of them may go back to the United States if the conditions are different.
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting all this up, at least helping describe what's going on. In our next session, we'd love to discuss some thoughts about where do you think it's going to wind up? I mean, because we've got a population that is suffering the way you described it is, we can't afford to live and we don't have any water, etc. Well, that's dire, what we would call dire, that they can't continue that operationally. So and we'd love to talk our next session about what then are possible outcomes of that and what implication would that have. And particularly since you've set it up as, and the current regime has successfully repressed a organized group that would step into power. And because there's nobody to step into power, then it leaves everything kind of in limbo. So I think we need to have that discussion next time. So thank you so much for sharing all that, guys. It's very, very helpful for us because we get such a limited viewpoint here that it really gives a clarity about at least the situation. And then the question is going to be, where do we watch? What do we look for to see what the implication of that's going to be? So thank you so much, Eric and Ephraim and Denny, and we'll pick it up next time.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.